Infernal Hails, everyone. It's episode 220 of Radio Free Innsmouth. This week we'll be talking about the great-grandfather of all things metal in Japan, that being the band Loudness.
약간 잡다한 것들이 다 들어가 있어요. 어디에 넣기도 애매한 거.
Okay, yeah, technically, not the originators of metal in Japan, or even the first band from there to get famous abroad playing heavy metal. For that, you would have to go to another band called Bow Wow that got started way back in the 70s, and actually did some very ahead of their time type stuff, particularly on their second album. This song right here is entitled Electric Power Up. It's off of that second album, Signal Fire. From what I've read, Metallica actually planned on covering the song back in the day, but never got around to it. It makes sense because, especially for 1977, that's pretty darn close to some sort of like early proto-thrash. Definitely ahead of its time in terms of speed and fury. Later on, towards the middle of the 80s, after putting out a whole bunch of albums, they changed their name to Bow Wow and started playing some much more like keyboard-heavy stuff that honestly sounded like battle music from like an early Megami Tensei game or something. Really cool, kind of weird sci-fi-ish touch with those keyboards over what is some pretty darn good early speed metal. So there you go. We brought up Bow Wow. Maybe I'll do an episode on them later because they were probably the first Japanese metal band to get really, really big. And they influenced a whole lot of stuff, particularly like ex-Japan and shit. And they were pretty well known abroad.
어플로 주문을 하던가?
And yeah, before them there was in fact the Flower Traveling Band. And there's other stuff like Heavy Metal Army and Murasaki and shit. But if you are from the West and you only know one Japanese heavy metal band, it's probably going to be Loudness. And so that is what this episode is going to be about. To start off with, we're going to have to do this episode a little bit differently than some of the other discography overviews I've done in the past. And this is because if you try to get into Loudness by simply starting with the first album and then just going forward,
you will fail!
Look, there's nothing wrong with those early Loudness albums. In fact, they're all really good. But if you're trying to get into Loudness, you want to start with the fifth album, Thunder in the East. I guarantee you'll have an easier time. It's the album that everyone knows. It's got their big song, you know, with
fucking like
the and
yeah, like some like
the you know, it's got what you need. And it has a brilliant production job, possibly the best one they've ever had, that really brings out the sound of Loudness. And apart from like the one big famous single, it's also just got a whole lot of their best songs. It's probably my favorite album of theirs. So if you were around in the 80s, you might actually recognize those clips. You might remember that song. You're like, hey, that was that wacky, they were like a hair metal band, but they were Japanese. It was hair metal stuff, right?
Wrong!
Well, they might get lumped in as like an old hair metal band nowadays. They've got a lot more going on than that. And specifically, most of that whole a lot more going on than that type stuff comes from their guitarist, a guy named Akira Takasaki. Now, when I tell you that there's a band in the 80s that a lot of people think is hair metal, and the reason they're not is because they have this crazy guitarist named Akira Takasaki, what do you think is going on there?
하나랑 룸 서비스를 영어로 시켜먹기였는데.
Right, you're thinking he's gonna be some like big shred god, like super speedy, fast solo guitarist. And while his shredding abilities are roughly on par with, say, an Yngwie,
if I played that any faster, your minds would blow up.
what really sets this guy apart is his very unusual, for heavy metal, kind of way of writing rhythm guitar riffs. This was something I didn't really pick up on until out of the blue, like a couple months ago. I just decided to try and learn some Loudness songs by ear, and I quickly ran into how bizarre and technical this man's technique is when it comes to writing guitar riffs. For instance, the second song on this album, entitled features what appears to be, at least on a surface level, a fairly standard sort of like power metal chug riff. To demonstrate the point I'm trying to make here, I'm gonna have to get out one of my guitars. And now the pitches aren't gonna quite line up because I play in C sharp standard and Loudness plays in E standard. But I believe I will be able to get my point across. So yeah, if you're figuring that riff out by ear, you'll probably end up coming up with something like this. It's a fairly natural way for a guitarist to try and play that riff. However, it is entirely incorrect. The actual riff goes like this. The difference there is the chords being used, or rather the intervals being used. See, the first version I played of that riff, it was utilizing what is commonly known as a power chord, but in terms of intervals is actually known as a perfect fifth. Intervals are essentially the spaces between notes in a scale, and power chords are highly utilized all over the rock spectrum because they are a perfect fifth, meaning the root note of the chord and then the other part of the chord are always 5 intervals apart, no matter if you're playing a major scale or a minor scale. Here's what a fifth sounds like. It's made up of 2 notes, and it's a perfect fifth because no matter if you're using a major scale or a minor scale, the first note in the chord will always be, and the second one's always going to be. That's why they're easy to write with, and that's why tons of metal bands always use power chords. Same with punk bands, same with most general like rock music type bands. However, Akira Takasaki does not limit himself to that kind of shit, because this riff does not use fifths. It uses a minor third and a major third, meaning that each chord in that riff is either made up of a root note and the third note up from that in a minor scale, or a root note and the third note up from that in a major scale. Here's a minor third. It's got 2 notes, which are 3 steps apart in a minor scale. And then it's got a major third, 2 notes, which are 3 notes away from each other in a major scale. And this whole act of shifting between a minor third and a major third lends that chug riff a rather interesting sense of tension. It almost sounds like it's being played on 2 different guitars, mostly because, at least in my case, I'm not usually used to hearing one guitar utilize a minor third into a major third like that. Whereas when you use a perfect fifth, everyone's so used to hearing that it doesn't really stick out and sound weird like it's 2 different guitars playing at the same time.
안 하더라고요.
Why am I going into so much detail with just like 2 chords and like what's a pretty decent sized song? Well, I think it represents in microcosm how interesting of a guitar player this Akira guy is. Because I kind of lied to you earlier when I said that was just kind of one singular chug riff. It's actually part of a much longer sort of segmented riff sequence that all kind of goes together into one musical phrase. It starts out with one rising action that goes like, which features that same minor third. And then it has a different rising action acting as sort of a counterpoint within the riff itself. And this boy's got that major third in it. And then that guy leads directly into a falling action, which initiates the chug riff. That weird falling action is probably the trickiest part of the song to play, and it includes a major third and a minor third, being hit backwards, so starting on the higher strings and then moving down to the lower ones. What really sets Loudness apart from so many other metal bands for me is that they managed to integrate all of these technically complex concepts into very catchy hook-driven pop songs. Because it's one thing to do all this weird shit in like a tech death band. For example, here's Crypticus, a death metal band I covered way back on episode 128. This guy's using all these wacky guitar techniques, but it all fits in because it's supposed to be this Lovecraftian and complicated death metal. But to have all of this weird shit going on, and it still ends up being a catchy pop song, that is some downright genius songwriting. And it speaks a lot to Akira Takasaki's skill as a guitar player that he's able to dance around some very pop metal style vocal lines from Minoru Nihara. First ascending action with a minor third, second ascending action with a major third, descending section with both into the chugs. And here's where the pop music genius comes in. He's playing that same weird technical riffing stuff, but he's rapping it very precisely around Minoru Nihara's catchy vocal lines. Here's another rising section. The whole sort of structure of this song actually mirrors the structure of its main riff, which is also very interesting, kind of compositional symmetry. Slamming very hard back into a variant of that main intro riff for an absolutely tremendous pop metal chorus. But he's still using all those like weird chords and shit, which is what makes Loudness a damn interesting band. if you ask me. The fact that Akira Takasaki can do all of this weird shit and still make it work in a pop song.
That is hot stuff.
And the fact that the production job on Thunder in the East is set up in such a way to make all of these weird guitar intricacies apparent with that very loud, sharp guitar sound is why I recommend starting with Thunder in the East before you go back into the rest of the Loudness back catalog. It gives you a good idea of what makes Loudness really cool. So Loudness started way back in 1981. Before that, in the 70s, everybody in the band except Minoru Nihara, the vocalist, had been in another band called Lazy, and apparently they all thought that band was kind of lazy. They thought it was like too regular pop hard rock, and they left to start a metal band. For 1981, the first Loudness album, The Birthday Eve, has a whole lot of impressively morbid heavy metal stuff going on, particularly given the time period. It doesn't really have that exceptionally sort of sharp sound to it that their later stuff is characterized by, but you can definitely hear the roots of why Loudness is such a special band, even as far back as their first album. But where it gets really good is on what is perhaps my other favorite Loudness album, besides Thunder in the East, that being the second Loudness album, the sophomore effort Devil Soldier, which features a lot of cool, expansive, epic chord work that honestly has more in common with where black metal would go later on than it does with any heavy metal of its day. And it's got those same delightfully sugary pop vocal lines that you've come to expect from Loudness. I think part of why this is one of my favorite Loudness albums is that it's so darn catchy. I pretty much managed to memorize the whole thing after a couple of listens. Check out the weird chords coming up in this transition. This is awesome. That weird little bouncy thing back into the main riff of the song.
That is hot stuff.
Speaking of weird chords, though, here we get to a very interesting part of Loudness's legacy. There's a song on here called Hard Working, and it features perhaps the oddest chord work on the album.
제가 V앱을 너무 안 한다고.
No, you're not crazy. That does, in fact, sound a whole lot like the kind of stuff Voivod would be doing later in the 80s, and there's a good reason for that. By the time Voivod started getting really weird, according to band members at the time, they really weren't influenced by any metal bands at all. They were more into weird punk bands like Chrome and Die Kreuzen. With one exception, there was one metal band that Voivod guitarist Piggy was still very much a fan of at the time, and that band was, of course, Loudness. You can look it up. That's actually how I first heard of Loudness way back when I was a teenager. Obviously, I wasn't a teenager when albums like Nothing Face were new. I'm talking about reading about this shit 20 years later when I was a teenager. That's where I first heard of Loudness, and you can see how Loudness would have influenced weird fucking chords like the ones they're using there. And what's even more bizarre about that is not only was this idea of really strange chords being utilized in a more metal context, jumping from Japan over to the West, it then runs back through Voivod from the West into Japan, resulting in the creation of one of the oddest thrash metal bands of all time, Doom, who I should probably do an episode on at some point because they are also wonderfully bizarre, as you're hearing right now. Sort of blending that weird Voivod shit that they got from Loudness back into more conventional thrash metal, sort of. It's definitely a little bit heavier than Voivod, a little less prog rocky. Most of the time until...
앞머리 안 자를 거예요.
Yeah, until that fretless bass comes out and the guitars get super psychedelic. Then it gets weird. I just thought this was a whole interesting example of cross-cultural ping-pong of various guitar playing techniques within the heavy metal sphere. I don't know. But those first three Loudness albums kind of belong to their own era of being kind of like their weirdest, most lo-fi and most Japanese sounding. Then you get to like Disillusion and Thunder in the East, Lightning Strikes and Hurricane Eyes. That's sort of the second era of Loudness. That was when they had the really sharp pop metal sound that we were talking about earlier. They went through something of another stylistic change when the vocalist Minoru Nihara left, and they got an American by the name of Michael Vescara in the band. Now this third era of Loudness is one of the more controversial ones, but I happen to like a decent amount of it. A lot of people accuse this era of sort of being like a glam metal sellout. I don't know, it sounds almost more like old school power metal to me. And while Minoru Nihara will always be the voice of Loudness in my mind, the new guy, Michael Vescara, he's got a pretty cool voice if you ask me. You know, for something that is often written off as an aborted attempt to enter the American pop music market, this stuff hits pretty goddamn hard with the classic Akira Takasaki riffs there. I mean, to accuse Loudness of going too pop kind of misses the point of Loudness anyways. The reason Loudness is cool is because he can do all these like weird guitar techniques in a pop music context. And there's lots of sick 80s heavy metal choruses. You gotta love that. However, what I do not love is the fact that the second Michael Vescara album is made up of a whole lot of like covers of older Loudness songs with the new guy on vocals. Something about that puts a bad taste in my mouth.
I know what you're thinking.
Jeb, you were defending this era of Loudness because it was pop sounding. Now you're saying you don't enjoy these newly re-recorded, much better produced, slightly more poppy versions of older songs.
I'm not gonna listen to that kind of bull crap, you know? It's like, you know, so, I mean...
And you know what? Logically, you're kind of right. My only defense is, apparently Loudness was thinking the same thing I was, because after Michael Vescara left to join Yngwie's touring band...
I'm the fastest in the world, I beat everyone.
Everybody except for the drummer and Akira the guitarist left. Then Akira reformed the band and essentially pulled a Judas Priest circa Painkiller by drastically abandoning any sort of like mainstream trappings in favor of what is probably Loudness's heaviest sound ever. And what's even cooler about this isn't just Loudness's Painkiller, it's also Painkiller for the new members of the band who came from other big Japanese heavy metal bands. The vocalist is now a guy named Masaki Yamada, who is sort of having his own existential crisis. You see, he used to be in a band called Flatbacker that were really cool early Japanese heavy metal in their own right. Here's a standout cut from the first Flatbacker album. It's entitled Nemesis, and it's obviously a really powerful, old-school heavy metal style riff. So this band put out 2 albums under the name Flatbacker, and then, under the advice of a whole lot of American hard rock people, including Gene Simmons, they changed their name to Ezo and did 2 more albums, the first of which featured a re-recording of that Nemesis song. And you know, it's not bad. It's got like a nice, very late 80s hard rock production. That snare has a whole lot of weight to it. It's pretty darn heavy for glam rock. But like with those Loudness recovers of their older songs, the newer vocalist, there's something missing. In this case, they're not missing the sort of je ne sais quoi atmospheric band synergy type thing that Loudness had with their old vocalist. Rather, that riff right there, that pretty much became the whole song. They cut out this entire cool little thrash metal bit that was in the middle of the original version. Like all this cool shit right here, which used that intro riff as a jumping off point, it's completely gone in the Ezo version of the song, and it's a damn shame. And I think they probably weren't happy that they had to do that to get some sort of mainstream acceptance, because after 2 albums with their new, more pop style, very different from what you're hearing right now, they broke up. The guitarist actually won the lottery while they were touring in the US, so he stayed here and became a pretty well-acclaimed sushi chef, and the drummer ended up joining Anthem. So you got this vocalist just kind of floating out there in the ether. What the hell's he gonna do? Well, he joins Loudness for his Heaviness redemption arc. Similarly, the new bassist in the band is Taiji Sawada, who had just left X-Japan. Now, X-Japan didn't really have any sort of like sellout adjacent type stuff going on. If anything, it was the opposite, because this Taiji guy had been in the band since the beginning. He leaves after the Jealousy album. So while they're working on the Art of Life album, which is 1 half-hour long song that's sort of a hybrid between neoclassical speed metal and orchestral music, a far cry from the very thrash influenced shit they were doing in the 80s. He's like, I want to do heavier shit too, so he joins this new crazy version of Loudness. And that's what I mean when it's like Painkiller for multiple bands, because this new Loudness album, the self-titled Loudness, not only was it their heaviest album, it also became their best-selling album in Japan. So their audience totally bought into this resurgence of heaviness. And I believe the reason for that is because this was entirely authentic. Authentic in terms of artistic intent, and authentic in terms of being the heaviest fucking album that Loudness ever made. The vocals are obviously a whole lot gruffer than either Minoru Mihara or Michael Vescara's performance, and they fit the angry, aggro nature of this music. The guitar playing seems a lot angrier too, not just because it incorporates more thrash metal stuff, but because of how dissonant and weird the accents are. Just a whole lot of like odd shrieking guitar noises. It's a great album. Probably my third favorite. And I think that about sums up the classic era of Loudness. They had albums after this one. They even ended up getting back their original vocalist towards the dawn of the new millennium. But I mean, you see how long that red bar's going. This has already been a long fucking episode. I just had to get my thoughts on Loudness out there before it turned into, you know, the Gargoyle episode that still hasn't happened. Anyways, hope you liked it. See you next time. Bye. Thanks for watching.
Holy shit, wow. Ah, shit. Damn. Oh, son of a bitch, wow.